Colonel Nathan Briggs snatched the file, read one name, and threw it across the table. Remove her from my program. Today. He had not spoken to her, had not watched her shoot, had not read a single line of her combat record. He had only seen that she was a woman. 24 of America's deadliest operators watched him do it. Not one objected. Claire Donovan stood at the door with her duffel bag still on her shoulder and heard every word. She didn't flinch, didn't argue, just looked at the man who had already decided she would fail and made one silent promise. He would regret this moment. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere before you were even given a chance to prove otherwise, then this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The bus rolled into Naval Amphibious Base Coronado just before 5 in the morning, and the Pacific Ocean was still dark. Sergeant Claire Donovan sat near the back, her duffel bag between her boots, her eyes fixed on the black water through the scratched window. She had not slept on the 6-hour drive down from Camp Pendleton. Not because she was nervous, because she had learned a long time ago that sleep was a luxury you earned, and she hadn't earned anything yet. Not here. Not today. She was 34 years old. She had 2 combat deployments in her service record, 1 commendation for marksmanship under fire in a situation so classified, the commendation itself had been filed without details, and a kill record that 3 different commanding officers had described in separate reviews using the same word, extraordinary. None of that would matter in the next few minutes. She knew it before the bus even stopped. She knew it from the way the man standing at the edge of the parking apron crossed his arms the moment the headlights swept across him. Colonel Nathan Briggs had been standing there for 40 minutes. Not because he was required to, because he had read the manifest the previous evening and he wanted to see the moment for himself. The candidates filed off the bus in silence, 23 men, most of them already carrying the particular kind of quiet that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Rangers, Force Recon, SEALs who had washed out of other programs and come back for a second shot. The kind of men that other men stopped talking when they walked into a room. Claire stepped off last. She was not small and she was not apologetic about how she stood. 5'8", compact in the shoulders, the kind of posture that comes from years of lying perfectly still in uncomfortable positions and training your body to betray nothing. She had short dark hair cut to regulation and she carried her duffel the same way the others carried theirs, with one hand and no visible effort. Briggs watched her walk down the 2 steps from the bus to the pavement, and he didn't say a word for a full 10 seconds. Then he said loudly enough for all 24 candidates to hear clearly, "Sergeant Donovan." She stopped. "Sir, do you know what this program produces?" "America's most capable long-range marksman, sir." Briggs walked towards her slowly, not hurried, the kind of slow that is deliberate, that is meant to communicate something, that is designed to let every person standing on that apron understand exactly who holds the power in this equation. He stopped 18 inches from her face. "That's right," he said. "Marksman. You understand the word I just used?" Several of the men near the front of the formation shifted their weight. One of them, a big ranger named Tyler Reed, looked down at the pavement. "I understand it, sir," Claire said. "Do you? Because in 31 years of producing elite combat snipers for this country, I have never graduated a woman. Not because the opportunity wasn't presented. Because the opportunity was presented and the result was always the same. You want to know what the result was?" Claire said nothing. She held his eyes. "The result," Briggs said, "was that we wasted 6 weeks of training time on someone who did not belong here. 6 weeks that could have been spent developing a candidate with a realistic future in this specialty. Are you following me, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "You are here because a memo came down from a general who has never spent a single day lying in a hide site, and that memo said we had to give you a fair evaluation." He paused. "I intend to give you exactly that, a fair evaluation. And when you fail that fair evaluation, the memo will be satisfied and the program will return to producing what it has always produced." He turned and walked back to the front without waiting for a response. Standing in the formation, Tyler Reed exhaled slowly through his nose and stared at the horizon. Behind him, a Force Recon sergeant named Delaney leaned 2 millimeters toward the man on his left and whispered without moving his lips, "He just told her she's already failed." The man on his left said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The first full day began at 0430 with a 5-mile run that was not described as a 5-mile run, but as a movement to training area, and was understood by every candidate to be the first of dozens of unmerciful physical filters. Claire finished it sixth, not first, sixth. She had calculated very deliberately where she needed to finish. First would have drawn a specific kind of attention. Dead last would have confirmed what Briggs had already announced. Sixth was invisible. Sixth was the position of someone doing exactly what is required and reserving everything else. She ate her breakfast standing up because there were no chairs left by the time the food was ready, and she ate it without mentioning the absence of a chair to anyone. And when Tyler Reed appeared beside her holding a metal folding chair he had taken from somewhere and set it down without explanation, she sat in it and said, "Thank you." Reed said, "I've got a sister about your age. She's a federal air marshal." He paused. "Just thought I'd mention it." Claire looked at him. He was looking at his food. "Noted," she said. The morning session was Marksmanship Fundamentals Review, which was an insult disguised as instruction because every person on that range could shoot, and reviewing the fundamentals was the program's way of watching how candidates behaved when they were bored and condescended to. The real evaluation was never the test they told you about. Claire went through the review methodically. She answered every question when called on. She did not correct the instructor when the instructor made a minor error about ballistic drift at 400 meters. She filed the error away and said nothing. But the man beside her, a SEAL named Kowalski, who had already decided he disliked her for reasons he hadn't fully articulated to himself, noticed that she hadn't corrected the instructor, and he leaned over and said quietly and unpleasantly, "You do know he got that wrong, right?" "Yes," she said, "but you didn't say anything." "No." "Why not?" She turned and looked at him. "Because this isn't where I prove what I know. This is where I learn what they're watching for." Kowalski stared at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the front of the room. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the session. The rifle range began at noon. This was the part that mattered. Everything else in the program was scaffolding. The shooting was the building, and everyone on that range knew it. The first qualification string was a standard military marksmanship drill, 10 rounds, 5 targets. Distances from 300 to 800 meters. Wind call required. Elevation adjustment required. A passing score was 7 out of 10. A competitive score was 9. Briggs stood behind the firing line with his spotting scope and his clipboard and watched. The first 8 candidates shot. Results ranged from 7 to 9. Reed, who was a genuinely gifted shooter, put 9 out of 10 in the center mass of the target silhouettes and said nothing, only reloaded. Claire shot last. She took her position, made her adjustments, checked her dope against the wind indicator flags at the 300-meter line and the 750 line, and then disregarded both of them. She looked instead at the seagulls. There were 3 of them riding the thermals over the range, and the way they were angling their wings told her something the flags weren't telling her, because the flags measured the wind at ground level, and the gulls were reading the air at the elevation her rounds would travel through at distance. It was something her father had told her when she was 14 years old. Flags tell you what the wind is doing at the pole. Birds tell you what the wind is doing where your bullet's going to be. She made one final adjustment that no one watching understood because it contradicted what the flags were showing. She fired. 10 rounds, 10 impacts, every one of them within the center scoring ring. A perfect score. The range went quiet for a moment in the way that ranges go quiet when something happens that changes the social contract of the environment. Then the range safety officer called the targets and read the score aloud. Briggs lowered his spotting scope. He wrote something on his clipboard. He walked to the range safety officer, took the score sheet, looked at it for a long moment, and then said to no one in particular, but loudly enough that the candidates standing behind the firing line could all hear, wind flags were showing a right to left at 4 knots. Sergeant Donovan's adjustment was set for a right to left at 6, inconsistent with the available data. He handed the score sheet back. Noted in the record. Reed turned and looked at Delaney. Delaney gave him the smallest possible shake of his head. "Don't." Claire said nothing. She began the process of clearing her weapon. That evening in the barracks, the candidates had exactly 40 minutes of unstructured time before lights out. Most of them used it to do laundry or write to their families or sit in silence, staring at the ceiling in the particular way of men who are very tired and need to be alone in a room full of other people. Tyler Reed sat down on the footlocker across from Claire's bunk. That was a perfect score, he said. I know. He noted it as inconsistent. I know that too. Reed rubbed the back of his neck. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been in the Army for 12 years. I've known guys who got passed over because of who they know, because of where they went to school, because of some administrative thing nobody ever explains to your face. He paused. This is different. What he's doing to you is different from all of that. Claire folded a piece of clothing with the precise efficiency of someone who has packed and unpacked the same duffel bag in hostile environments and knows exactly how much time can be wasted on it. What he's doing to me, she said, is giving me exactly the information I need. Which is what? She looked at Reed. He's telling me that every standard evaluation is going to be questioned, which means the only shot that counts is the one that can't be questioned. The one that's so undeniable it doesn't matter what he writes on the clipboard. Reed was quiet for a moment. Ghost target 7, he said. The words landed in the barracks like a stone dropped into still water. Every man in the room who was pretending not to listen stopped pretending. Ghost target 7, 1,900 meters, Nevada mountains. The shot that had ended the aspirations of more elite candidates than any other single qualification in the program's history. The shot that had never been made. The shot that Briggs himself, when he had been a young SEAL officer, had attempted 3 times and missed. That's the final qualification, Reed continued. And if you make it, I know what it is, Claire said. Nobody's ever made it in 32 years. I know. He said it himself today during the briefing. He called it physically impossible under current atmospheric conditions. He used the word impossible. Claire zipped her duffel. My father used to say something about the word impossible. She paused. He said it was almost always the last thing someone says before someone else proves them wrong. She lay back on her bunk. Get some sleep, Sergeant, she said. Tomorrow's going to be hard. The second week was harder than the first in the way that physical programs always escalate, not gradually but in sudden lurches that leave the body confused and the mind uncertain. Candidates were woken at random hours for unscheduled drills. Sleep deprivation was engineered so precisely that it became its own form of evaluation because the ability to perform technical marksmanship when the brain was running on 3 hours in hostile weather was a significant portion of what the program was actually measuring. Claire slept when she could. She ate everything available. She drank water constantly. And she watched. She watched the instructors to understand what they were actually evaluating beneath what they said they were evaluating. She watched the other candidates to understand who was starting to fracture and who was becoming stronger. She watched Briggs. Briggs ran the course with a control that was close to surgical. He was rarely loud. He didn't need to be. Men who reach his rank in the organizations he had served in do not raise their voices because they don't need to. When Colonel Nathan Briggs spoke quietly, every person in the room heard it the way they would have heard a fire alarm. He evaluated candidates daily. He was fair to every candidate in the group in exactly the way he had promised Claire he would be precisely technically, and with a set of standards that, when applied to her, always managed to find some dimension of the result worth questioning. Her position in a hide site was technically correct, but lacking the intuitive adaptation expected at this level. Her wind call during a crosswind qualification was accurate, but relying on observation methodology not consistent with program doctrine. Her 2,000-meter grouping, which was tighter than any other candidate's 2,000-meter grouping, was noted as statistically unusual and requiring verification. Verification. The word arrived like a quiet slap. Reed was present when Briggs said it. He made a sound in the back of his throat that he immediately suppressed. Kowalski, standing 2 positions down the firing line, did not suppress his reaction. Verification of what? He said louder than he intended. Briggs turned and looked at him. I beg your pardon, Sergeant. The range went silent. Every instructor, every candidate, every support personnel within earshot turned toward Kowalski. Kowalski was not a man who backed down from confrontation. He had 3 combat deployments, a Silver Star, and the particular kind of stubbornness that comes from having been right in situations where everyone else was wrong. He held Briggs's gaze for 3 full seconds before he said more carefully this time, requesting clarification, sir. What aspect of Sergeant Donovan's grouping requires verification? Briggs said, Her methodology. The way a round gets to the target tells me as much as where it lands. If I can't confirm the process, I can't confirm the result. He turned back to the range. Kowalski looked at the back of his clipboard. Later in the chow line, he fell into step beside Claire. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking at her, I want to learn the wind thing, the bird thing. My colonel at Bragg used to talk about reading the environment instead of the instruments, but nobody ever explained it to me like it was actually teachable. Claire looked at him. Kowalski, who 2 weeks ago had watched her duffel land on the barracks floor and said within earshot, this is going to be a long 6 weeks. After chow, she said, give me 20 minutes. He nodded. The instructions she gave Kowalski that evening and the instructions she repeated 2 days later for Reed and 3 days after that for a force recon sergeant named Augustine, who approached her in the middle of a field exercise and said quietly, can you show me what you're seeing when you look at the grass before a shot? All of it came from the same source, her father's voice. Master Sergeant Claire Donovan, United States Marine Corps Scout Snipers, retired. A man who had deployed to 3 different conflicts over 20 years and had come home from all of them with his body largely intact and his mind working exactly the way it always had, except quieter. A man who had taught his daughter to shoot when she was 9, not because he wanted to produce a soldier, but because shooting was what he knew how to share. The rifle is the last step, he used to tell her. Everything before the trigger is the real skill. Any machine can pull a trigger. Only a mind that understands the physics, the environment, the moment only that mind makes the shot. She had listened. For 25 years, she had listened. He died 18 months before she arrived at Coronado. Lung cancer because the Marine Corps had spent 30 years not being completely honest about what certain airborne compounds at certain bases were doing to the people stationed there. She had been at his bedside for the last 3 weeks. In the last conversation, when he was barely able to sustain a full sentence, he had reached up and held her wrist and said with the precise clarity that sometimes arrives at the very end, the shot they say can't be made was the one you were built to make. Don't you accept their limits as your own. Promise me. She had promised him. She was here to keep that promise. By the end of the 3rd week, something had shifted in the barracks. It was not dramatic. It was not announced. It happened the way most real changes happen underneath the surface in the margins of the day when nobody is watching for it. Candidates began coming to Claire the way people go to someone they trust, which is without obvious intention, and with questions that sound casual but aren't. Delaney asked her during a maintenance session if she had a better method for cleaning the chamber in high particulate environments. She did. She showed him. A younger candidate from the SEAL pipelines named Harkins, who was 26 and visibly struggling with the sleep deprivation cycle in a way that made the instructors look at him with the particular evaluative neutrality that precedes a dropout conversation, sat down next to her during a break and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, how do you do it? How do you perform after 3 hours of sleep when the test is something that requires your hands to be completely still? She considered the question. You've been trying to override the fatigue, she said. You're telling yourself you're not tired and your body knows you're lying and it fights back. Stop lying to it. What do I do instead? Accept that you're exhausted. Tell yourself I am very tired right now and I'm going to perform anyway because performance and comfort are not the same requirement. Your body can do the job without feeling good. It just needs you to stop arguing with it. Harkins was quiet. My old platoon commander used to say something like that. Smart man. He's dead. He paused. IED, 2 years ago. Claire said nothing for a moment. Then she said, then you do it for both of you. Harkins looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed with fatigue and something else. He nodded once slowly and got up and went back to the line. 3 days later, he shot his best score of the program. Briggs saw all of it. He was not a careless man, and he had not built a 30-year career on inattention. He saw the way the group was organizing itself around her. He saw the quiet instruction sessions after hours. He watched the performance graphs of the candidates she worked with begin to trend upward in ways that benefited the program he ran, and it made him angrier. Not because they were getting better. He wanted them to get better. He had spent his adult life devoted to the production of the best possible human weapon system, and better was always the correct direction. He was angry because it was her. Because if she was this good, if she was actually this kind of operator, the kind who raised the entire cohort without being asked, without expectation, without political calculation, then the thing he believed about women in this specialty was not just wrong. It was something worse than wrong. It had always been wrong. He called his senior instructor, a chief petty officer named Maldonado, into his office on a Thursday evening and sat behind his desk and said without preamble, "What's your assessment of Donovan?" Maldonado, who was the most experienced instructor on the course and had a policy of answering questions honestly even when it was professionally inconvenient, said, "Best candidate in the class, technically, tactically, psychologically. If she were a man with the same record, you'd be talking about commissioning her into the program as an instructor candidate." Briggs said nothing. Maldonado said, "You asked." "I did," Briggs said. He looked at his desk. "Dismissed." That night, Nathan Briggs sat in his office until midnight, with the door closed, and thought about a girl who had tried to be a soldier and been driven out of a program by the weight of it, not by the physical requirements or the shooting scores, but by the pressure, by the isolation, by the compounded daily signal that she was in the wrong place. He thought about her face at the end of it. He thought about what he had believed about that outcome. He thought about Claire Donovan standing on his range, adjusting for a wind that the flags weren't showing, reading the birds the way his own best instructors couldn't do, and making a perfect score on a qualification string that the previous 3 classes had averaged 7.2 on. He picked up his coffee mug. He set it back down without drinking. The 4th week brought candidates down to 16. 8 had dropped. 2 were medical. 3 were voluntary withdrawals. 2 were administrative decisions that Maldonado had recommended and Briggs had approved without a second thought, because the numbers didn't lie and the numbers had been clear. 1 was Harkins. He was dropped on a technicality involving a procedural error on a night qualification that Maldonado had flagged correctly and that nobody, not Claire, not Reed, not anyone with the knowledge to argue it, believed was the real reason. But the decision was made, and Harkins gathered his gear with the particular silence of a man who has just had something taken from him that he will spend years trying to make peace with. Claire was standing in the corridor when he walked out with his bag. She didn't say anything immediately. She fell into step beside him to the door. At the door, Harkins stopped. He turned. "You're going to make that shot," he said. "Ghost 7. You're going to make it." She looked at him. "I know how you read the terrain," he said. "I've watched you. You already know something about that canyon that nobody else on this program knows. I can see it in how you've been paying attention." He paused. "Don't let him take that from you. Whatever he tries, don't let him." He went through the door. Claire stood there for a moment. Then she walked back to the barracks and picked up her notebook and wrote 3 lines in the margin of the last page. Not words, numbers. Atmospheric data she had been recording every morning and every evening about a canyon in Nevada that she had never been to, but had studied on every topographical and meteorological data set available to her. She had been building a picture of something. The picture was almost complete. The final week of the pre-qualification period was a stalk exercise that put the remaining 16 candidates into the field individually tasked with reaching a firing position undetected, making a confirmed shot on a target location, and withdrawing without being identified. Claire had been the best stalker in the first-class evaluation. She moved through terrain the way her father had described the best snipers, moving not fast, not slow, but right. The right speed for the right cover. The right pause at the right moment. The right decision at every junction between the visible and the concealed. She reached her firing position in 1 hour 40 minutes. She had been given 4 hours. She made her shot confirmed and withdrew. The instructors graded the exercise over 2 hours. When the results were announced, Claire's stalk was graded as technically compliant, but time to position inconsistent with standard protocol, suggesting possible route deviation. Maldonado, reading the grade sheet, stopped. He looked at the senior instructor who had written it. The instructor met his eyes and said nothing. Maldonado set the sheet down on the table. He picked up his hat. He walked out of the evaluation tent and stood outside for a moment. Then he walked back in and said in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, "I am going to ask this question once. Was there a route deviation observed during the exercise?" Silence. "Because I was on observation duty," Maldonado continued, "and I did not observe a route deviation. I observed a candidate who reached her position in the most direct available path through that terrain in less than half the time. Given made her shot and extracted cleanly. If anyone has documentation of a route deviation, produce it. No one produced it. Maldonado picked up the grade sheet, crossed out the annotation, initialed it, and set it back down. He looked at the room. We are producing the best snipers in the world, he said quietly. Let's behave like it. Nobody talked about it that evening. But in the barracks, Tyler Reed found Claire sitting on her footlocker, sharpening a pencil with a small folding knife, which was a habit she had picked up from her father, who sharpened pencils when he was thinking and couldn't settle. Reed sat down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Maldonado went to bat for you today. I know. He could have just let it go. He could have. Why do you think he didn't? Claire was quiet for a moment. Because he's an honest man, she said. And honest men, when they see something clearly, have a hard time pretending they didn't see it. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the final qualification is in 8 days. I know. Ghost target 7. I know. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Do you actually believe you can make that shot? She looked at him. Not the look of someone searching for reassurance, the look of someone answering a question they have already answered. I don't just believe it, she said. I've already made it. I've made it in every way that matters except pulling the trigger. I've studied the thermal cycle in that canyon every morning for 30 days. I know when the window opens. I know how long it holds. I know the exact adjustment I'll need. She paused. All I have to do is be there when the window comes. Reed stared at her. Your father taught you all of that. My father, she said, taught me to understand that there is always a window. The canyon doesn't care who you are. Physics doesn't care what Colonel Briggs wrote on his clipboard. The air is the air. The wind does what it does. All that matters is whether you're paying attention. She set down her pencil. I've been paying attention. Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, he's going to try to stop you. Between now and the final day, he's going to find a way. Claire picked up her notebook. Let him try. She opened it to the last page. 3 lines of numbers, atmospheric data, temperature gradients, and thermal inversion cycles mapped across 30 mornings and 30 evenings of patient invisible observation. The picture her father had told her to build. The picture that was now complete. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed the notebook and lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about a promise made at a hospital bedside and about the kind of shot that ends arguments and about the exact moment when a window that has been closed for 32 years opens for the first time. 8 days. She closed her eyes. Load later messages. 8 days before the final qualification, Colonel Nathan Briggs called a mandatory formation at 0500 and stood in front of 16 candidates in the gray pre-dawn and announced a change to the training schedule. We're adding a night precision qualification, he said. 0 illumination, moving targets, distance 800 to 1200 meters. It runs tomorrow night and scores carry weight into the final evaluation. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But every candidate in that formation understood exactly what had just happened because the night precision qualification had never been part of the program's final week before. It wasn't in the course documentation. It wasn't in the schedule that had been briefed to them on arrival day. It was new, and it was announced the morning after Maldonado had crossed out a fraudulent annotation on Claire Donovan's stock evaluation. Tyler Reed stood 3 positions to Claire's left and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. Briggs folded his hands behind his back. Any questions? Silence. Good, he said. Dismissed. As the formation broke, Reed moved toward Claire. She was already walking. He matched her pace. He's escalating, Reed said low. Yes. A 0 illumination moving target qualification at 1200 meters is not a standard sniper evaluation. That's special mission unit territory. That's selection for something different entirely. I know what it is. Can you shoot it? She glanced at him without slowing. Can you? He was quiet for a moment. Probably, if the conditions cooperate. Then stop worrying about me, she said, and start worrying about the conditions. She peeled off toward the equipment bay and left him standing in the corridor. Kowalski appeared at his shoulder. The 2 men watched her go. She already knew he'd do something like this, Kowalski said. What makes you say that? Because she didn't react, not even a little. When a person is genuinely surprised, something moves in their face. Nothing moved in hers. He paused. She was ready for it. Reed turned this over for a moment. Then he said, "That's either the most reassuring thing I've heard all week or the most unsettling." Kowalski shrugged. "With her, I'm starting to think those might be the same thing." The day moved fast and brutal. A full physical conditioning block in the morning that Briggs ran personally, which was unusual, which meant he wanted to see exactly where the fatigue reserve stood in each candidate before he put them on a range in the dark the following night. Then a written examination on ballistics theory that ran 3 hours and covered material from the advanced block that 3 candidates had not yet finished reviewing. Claire finished the written examination in 1 hour 40 minutes. She set her pencil down, checked her work once, and sat quietly until the time expired. The instructor collecting the papers glanced at her completion time and wrote something on his own clipboard that he didn't share with anyone. After the examination, there was a 2-hour maintenance period. Claire used 40 minutes of it to clean her rifle with the unhurried attention of someone who considers the task genuinely important rather than procedurally required. She used the remaining 80 minutes to sit in the equipment bay with a small notebook and write nothing visible to anyone who passed through, only looked at the page, thought, and occasionally made small marks that were not words. Delaney walked through the bay twice and both times tried to read the notebook from the appropriate angle. Both times he failed. The third time he passed through, he just asked, "What are you working on?" "Wind patterns," she said. "For tomorrow night. For the canyon." He stopped. "The qualification isn't for 8 days. 7 now," she said. "And thermal data doesn't appear in the last 7 days. It builds across weeks. If I don't understand the baseline, I can't interpret the deviation." Delaney pulled a stool from under the workbench and sat down. He was a thoughtful man who had grown up in rural Louisiana hunting deer from the age of 8, and he understood the instinct she was describing, even if he had never organized it into scientific language. "My grandfather used to read the weather by the way cattle stood in the field," and he said, "Smart grandfather." He said, "Instruments tell you what's already happened. Animals tell you what's about to." Claire looked up from her notebook. "Exactly that," she said. "Exactly." She went back to her page. Delaney sat there for another few minutes not talking, and she didn't ask him to leave, which he understood as a form of permission. Outside in the corridor, 2 instructors passed the bay door, and one of them said, loud enough to carry inside without being obviously aimed at anyone, "I give the woman 3 more days before the night qual breaks her." Delaney looked at Claire. She did not look up from her notebook. "Told you," she said quietly to no one in particular. "Exactly the information I need." The night qualification ran the following evening under a sky that offered no moon and a wind that came in from the northwest in irregular pulses that made range estimation an ongoing negotiation rather than a settled calculation. Briggs had the targets mounted on motorized sleds that moved in unpredictable lateral patterns at distances that were announced to each candidate individually in rotation, with no time to observe another candidate's shoot before your own. It was designed to eliminate any possibility of collaborative advantage. Each candidate went alone into the firing position. Each candidate received their own range card. Each candidate had 20 minutes to make 3 confirmed impacts on moving steel at distances between 800 and 1,200 meters in zero illumination, with only a thermal optic that the program had issued that afternoon, which none of them had trained on extensively. The first 3 candidates to shoot came back with 1 confirmed impact each. The fourth, a Force Recon Marine named Vasquez, who was one of the 3 best shooters in the class, came back with 2 confirmed. Reed went 6th. He came back with 2 confirmed and a borderline third that the range officer called uncertain, which meant it went into the score as a half credit. Claire went 11th. She walked to the firing position in the dark, lay down, and spent the first 4 minutes not shooting. She spent those 4 minutes listening, not to the wind instruments, not to the moving sled, to the pattern, the rhythm of the wind's inconsistency. Because even inconsistency has a pattern if you listen long enough, and the pattern tells you where the gaps are, and the gaps are where you shoot. Her father's voice, patient and unhurried in the back of her mind. The shot waits for you. You don't chase it. You learn the rhythm, and you step into it. She fired her first round at 4 minutes and 14 seconds into the window. Confirmed impact. She adjusted, waited, read the next gap in the wind pulse. Fired, confirmed. She waited longer for the third. The sled changed direction twice. The wind shifted a full quarter point. She recalculated without writing anything, doing the adjustment in her head the way she had been doing ballistics calculations in her head since she was 17 years old. She fired. Confirmed. 3 for 3. The only 3 for 3 score in the entire qualification. She came back to the staging area, and no one said anything immediately. The range officer wrote her score on the board. Kowalski, standing to the left of the board, looked at Reed and looked back at the board. Reed said under his breath, 3-4-3. Kowalski said, on a qualification that didn't exist until this morning. Reed said nothing. Kowalski said, he gave her a test she'd never trained for with equipment she'd never used in conditions designed to be unreadable, and she shot better than any of us. He paused. That should terrify every person in this program, including the man who designed the test. The score went up on Briggs's clipboard the next morning during the review. Briggs looked at it for a long time. Then he said, Sergeant Donovan's thermal optic was miscalibrated. We confirmed it this morning during equipment check. A miscalibrated optic introduces artificial ballistic compensation that may have produced score inflation. The range went completely silent. Every candidate felt it. The particular quality of the silence that occurs when something deeply unfair is done in plain sight, and everyone present knows it, and no one has the rank to say so. Everyone except one, Maldonado. Chief Petty Officer Vincent Maldonado had 30 years of service, a record that included 2 combat deployments, where his decisions had kept people alive who should have died, and a professional reputation that made his evaluations essentially unimpeachable. He was not a man who enjoyed confrontation. But he was, as Claire had told Reed, an honest man. And honest men have a hard time pretending they didn't see something clearly. He said, Sir, the equipment check this morning was conducted by my team. I signed off on it personally. Every optic in the qualification was zeroed identically before the exercise. Sergeant Donovan's optic was not miscalibrated. The silence deepened. Briggs turned and looked at him. Then there will be a secondary verification, Briggs said. Sir, Maldonado said, I'll stand behind my check. Briggs held his eyes for a long moment. Every person on that range held their breath. Then Briggs said, noted, turned and walked off the range. The collective exhale of 15 candidates was almost audible. Reed looked at Claire. She was looking straight ahead. Her expression had not changed. He leaned 6 inches toward her and said very quietly, You realize what just happened? Yes, she said. Maldonado just put himself between you and Briggs, in front of witnesses. That's a career moment. Either way it goes. I know. And you're not going to say anything about it. She turned and looked at him. What would you like me to say, Sergeant? He had no answer for that. She picked up her rifle case and walked off the range. The 5th day after the night qualification, with 3 days remaining before the convoy to Nevada, something happened that no one in the program had anticipated. Briggs called Claire into his office. Not to the briefing room, not to the range, to his actual office, which was a small room at the end of the administrative corridor with a metal desk, a photograph of a SEAL platoon from a deployment in the early 2000s, and a coffee maker that ran continuously, regardless of the hour. Claire knocked. Enter. She came in and stood in front of his desk without being invited to sit. He did not invite her to sit. He was looking at a file on his desk, which she could see from the position she was standing was her service record. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said without looking up, Your father was Raymond Donovan. It was not a question. Yes, sir, she said. Marine Scout Sniper. 2 deployments, served in Fallujah. He turned a page. His commanding officer's review from his 2nd deployment describes him as the finest long-range marksman in his unit, possibly in his regiment. He paused. He's been dead 18 months. 19, she said. Briggs turned another page. He was quiet again. The coffee maker gurgled. Neither of them acknowledged it. You applied to this program 14 months ago, he said. Yes, sir. Your application was initially rejected. It was. And you reapplied. Yes, sir. He finally looked up. His face was the face of a man in the middle of a private reckoning that he had not planned to conduct in front of an audience, but that had arrived on its own schedule. Why, Mon, he said. She looked at him. Sir, why reapply? The rejection was official. The language was clear. Why come back? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Because I promised my father I would. Briggs held her eyes. She held his. He looked back down at the file. Your marksmanship scores, he said slowly, are the highest in the current class. In 3 of the 4 qualification categories, they are the highest scores recorded in this program in 11 years. She said nothing. Your stock evaluation was the fastest completion time in the current class by 22 minutes. Nothing. Your night qualification result was the only 3 for 3 score achieved, despite the fact that you had less cumulative training time with the thermal optic than any other candidate. Nothing. He closed the file. He looked at her again, and this time something was different in his expression. Not softness. Briggs was not a soft man, and he was not performing softness. It was something more complicated. The look of a man who has held a position for a very long time and has just felt it shift beneath him. Dismissed it, he said. She turned and walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when he said quietly, Sergeant. She stopped. Your father's instinct about thermal windows, he said. Did he document it anywhere? Any methodology? Any written framework? She turned back. He was looking at his desk. He documented it in me. Jabam, she said. She walked out. That evening, Reed found Maldonado behind the equipment bay alone having a cup of coffee from a thermos and looking at nothing in particular. Reed was not the kind of man who initiated conversations with senior NCOs about things that weren't his business. He had 12 years of Army service and a solid understanding of lane boundaries. But he stopped, and after a moment, Maldonado looked at him, and Reed said, Are you going to be all right, Chief? Maldonado considered this. Professionally? Yes, sir. Probably. He took a sip of coffee. Briggs is a fair man in most things. What he's doing to Donovan isn't malice. It's fear dressed up in methodology. And fair men, when they finally see what they've been doing, tend to stop. He paused. Whether that happens before the final qualification or after it, I can't tell you. Reed digested this. And if it happens if he finds a way to disqualify her result, even if she makes the shot, Maldonado looked at him. Then I have a very detailed documentation file and a very strong relationship with a 2-star general who agrees with me that this program's evaluation processes has some correctable problems. He paused. But I don't think it'll come to that. Reed was quiet. Why not? Because if she makes ghost target 7, Maldonado said, there isn't a clipboard in the world that matters anymore. 2 days before the convoy to Nevada, Claire disappeared for 3 hours. Not absent from duty. She told the duty officer she was conducting independent training, which was within program guidelines and signed out properly. But she went somewhere, no one tracked her, and when she came back, she went directly to the equipment bay and sat with her notebook for a long time. Reed, who had been mildly concerned in the low-grade way that you're concerned about someone whose success you've come to care about personally, without having planned to ask her at dinner where she'd gone. The range, she said. Which range? The long range. The one that's been closed for maintenance. He looked at her. That range is at the back of the base. It's 1,500 meters. 1480, Wakpoisi, she said. You were shooting, observing. Observing what? She set her fork down. The way the marine layer comes in off the ocean at this time of year and interacts with the inland thermal gradient. The canyon in Nevada has a similar characteristic. Different topography, but the mechanism is the same. She paused. I needed to see it one more time before we drive out there. Reed stared at her. You've been building a profile of that canyon for over a month. Yes. Without ever being there. Correct. Based on atmospheric data you've been collecting manually every day, and topographic analysis, and historical weather records for that specific valley floor going back 4 years, which I requested through a training access form 2 weeks after I arrived. The table was quiet. Kowalski, who was sitting across from them and had been pretending not to listen since the beginning of the conversation, stopped pretending. You filed a training access form for historical meteorological data on the Nevada qualification range, he said. Yes. On week 1. Yes. He looked at Reed. Reed looked at him. Kowalski said slowly, she's been preparing for Ghost 7 since before she got here. I've been preparing for Ghost 7, Claire said without drama, since my father told me about it when I was 17 years old. The table went very quiet. He knew about it, Reed said. He tried it twice, both times in conditions that didn't give him a window. She picked up her fork again. He said the canyon wasn't unshootable. He said nobody had ever been there at the right moment in the cycle with the preparation to take advantage of it. She ate. He told me, she said, that when I got there, I would be the first one who had. Nobody spoke for the remainder of dinner. The night before the convoy, Briggs came to the barracks. Not at lights out, an hour after. When the room was dark and the candidates who were trying to sleep were either asleep or pretending to be, which in a program of this type amounted to the same thing. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he walked to the end of the room where the duty NCO's desk sat empty at this hour and pulled out the chair and sat down. Every person in that room who was awake knew he was there. Nobody moved. He sat there for about 10 minutes. Then he said quietly to the room in general, and no one in particular, "I've been running this program for 11 years. In 11 years, I have graduated 216 candidates. Every one of them is alive. Every one of them is operational or retired with honor. That record matters to me more than any other number in my service file." Silence. I've spent my career believing that the standards I maintain are the reason for that record. That protecting those standards was the same as protecting the people who went through this program. That keeping certain people out was the same as keeping the program safe. The room was absolutely still. "Tomorrow we drive to Nevada," he said. "There's a target out there that nobody has hit in 32 years. Physics says the shot is possible. Human performance history says it hasn't been done. Those are two different statements, and I've spent 32 years treating them as the same statement." He stood up. He walked back toward the door. At the doorway, he stopped. "Get some sleep," he said. "All of you." He walked out. In the dark, 3 seconds passed. Then Reed's voice, barely a breath. "Did that just happen?" From across the room, Delaney, "I'm not sure." From the far end, Kowalski, very quiet. "I think the colonel just told us something without telling us something." And then from Claire's bunk, nothing. Because Claire was lying on her back in the dark with her eyes open and her hand resting on the notebook on the blanket beside her, and she was listening to the sound of a belief system beginning to fracture in the mind of a man who had built his career on it. She had known it was coming, not because she was extraordinary at reading people, though she was, because her father had told her the people who fight hardest against something that's true tend to be the ones who already know it's true and are most afraid of what happens when they admit it. She looked at the ceiling. 7 hours to the convoy. She closed her eyes. She had already made every adjustment that could be made with data. What remained was not preparation. What remained was execution. And execution, her father had taught her, is not a decision you make in the moment. It is the result of every decision you made in the weeks and months before the moment arrived. She thought about his hands, steady even at the end when the rest of him was failing. Still steady. She had held those hands in the last week, and she had felt the stillness in them, and she had understood that it was not calm. It was discipline so deeply embedded it had become the body's default state. She wanted to carry that stillness into the canyon. She thought she could. She thought she might. 1 hour later, when the barracks was genuinely quiet and even the lightest sleepers had finally let go, she opened her notebook one more time. Not to read. She had memorized everything in it. She opened it to the last page. She read the 3 lines of atmospheric data she had written the night she first understood the thermal cycle of the canyon. The numbers that had seemed like speculation 30 days ago and now felt like certainty. She added a 4th line, not data. A date, tomorrow's date, and beside it 3 words. The window opens. She closed the notebook. She set it on the footlocker. She closed her eyes, and this time she slept because discipline means sleeping when sleep is available, and she had learned that from a Marine Scout sniper who understood that the body's readiness on the day of the shot begins with the night before it. Outside, the base went quiet around her. The ocean moved against the shore a mile away, invisible and constant. The Nevada mountains waited dry and indifferent for the first light of morning and the convoy that would bring 16 candidates and 1 decision to their floor. And somewhere in the administrative wing, a light burned late in a colonel's office, where a man sat alone with a service record he had read 3 times and a belief he could no longer fully hold. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with that. But the knowing had arrived, and once that kind of knowing arrives, it does not leave quietly. It stays. It grows. It demands. The convoy left Coronado at 0400. 3 vehicles, 16 candidates, 4 instructors, Briggs in the lead vehicle sitting in the front passenger seat with his arms folded and his eyes forward saying nothing for the first 2 hours of the drive. Claire sat in the rear of the second vehicle between Reed and Delaney. The road north was empty at that hour and the headlights cut through darkness that felt absolute. Nobody talked much. The kind of silence that settles over people when they are driving towards something that matters, and words feel inadequate to the distance between where they are and where they need to be. Kowalski was in the third vehicle. He had spent the last 20 minutes before departure cleaning his rifle for the second time, which everyone understood was not about cleanliness. Reed had his eyes closed, but Claire could tell from his breathing he was not asleep. Delaney was looking out the window at nothing. At the 2-hour mark, somewhere in the Mojave, Delaney said quietly, "You sleep last night?" "Some," Claire said. "I didn't." He paused. "I kept thinking about what Briggs said in the barracks. That thing he said about treating two different statements as the same statement." "He's processing," Claire said. "Processing what?" She was quiet for a moment. The distance between what he believed and what he knows. Delaney turned and looked at her in the dark of the vehicle. "Those aren't always the same thing for people." "No," she said, "they're not. But when they get far enough apart, the tension gets unbearable, and one of them has to give." He was quiet for a moment. "Which one gives?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Depends on how honest the person is willing to be with themselves." The vehicle hit a long, straight section of highways, and the engine settled into a lower register. "And Briggs," Delaney said. "Honest man," she said. "He's just been honest in the wrong direction for a long time." She turned toward the window. "Go to sleep, Delaney," she said. "You're going to need it." They arrived at the Nevada Range facility at 0830. The mountain air was cooler than the desert floor had been, and the canyon was visible from the access road, a long, deep cut in the terrain that ran roughly north to south and had a reputation that preceded its geography. Every candidate who stepped out of those vehicles had heard the stories. Ghost Target 7, 32 years, 816 attempts, 0 confirmed impacts. The target itself was not visible from the staging area. It was set on the far side of the canyon at a measured distance of 1,420 meters, at an elevation 11 meters above the firing line, positioned on a rock shelf that required the round to transit a thermal inversion layer that the canyon generated through a combination of sun angle rock, temperature, differential, and channeled wind that behaved by its own rules and nobody else's. The range master at the Nevada facility, a civilian contractor named Oakes, who had been running this range for 19 years, met them at the staging area and gave the same briefing he had given every incoming class. "Ghost Target 7, he said without ceremony. "Steel plate, half-meter square, 1,420 meters. The target has instrumentation that confirms impacts. In 19 years of running this facility, that instrumentation has never triggered." He paused. "Colonel Briggs, your class." Briggs stepped forward. He looked at the 16 candidates in front of him. His face was composed and unreadable in the way that only becomes possible after decades of practice. "You have reviewed your range cards," he said. "You have your dope. You will shoot in the order posted. Each candidate fires 3 rounds. Impacts are confirmed by instrumentation. A single confirmed impact constitutes qualification." He paused. "Any questions?" Nobody had questions. Or rather, every person had the same question, which was whether today was going to be the day the 32-year record ended. And that was not a question you asked out loud. "Good," Briggs said. "First candidate to the line." The first candidate was a SEAL named Patterson. He had the second highest marksmanship scores in the class after Claire, and he had been shooting long-range rifles since he was a teenager in Wyoming. He lay down behind his rifle with the efficiency of long practice, made his adjustments, and fired 3 rounds across the canyon. 3 misses. He came back from the line without expression and took his position at the rear of the waiting group. The second candidate, a ranger named Chu, fired 3 rounds. 3 misses. The third, Vasquez, took longer between shots. He read his wind indicators with obvious care. He fired his first round and the instrumentation returned no signal. He adjusted and fired his second. No signal. He held for 45 seconds before firing his third. The canyon swallowed it. The pattern held through the first 6 candidates. 3 rounds each. 18 rounds fired. 18 misses. The canyon was not discriminating. It simply took what was given and offered nothing back. Reed went 9th. He fired his first round and the instrumentation was silent. His second round produced a sound that made several candidates look up from what they were doing, a high metallic crack that was different from the ambient echo of a miss, but the instrumentation returned no confirmed signal. His third round was silent. He came back to the line. His jaw was tight. "I hit the edge," he said to Delaney quietly. "I could hear it, but edge contact doesn't confirm." "How far off center?" "Can't tell from here. Far enough." He stood at the back of the group and said nothing else. Kowalski fired 11th. He had spent the previous 30 minutes watching every candidate with the focused attention of a man building a data set. He had a notebook of his own, smaller than Claire's, in which he had been writing observations. He went to the line, looked at his notes, made 3 adjustments that were slightly different from what the range card specified and fired. First round, no signal. Second round, no signal. Third round, a pause, a collective suspension of breath from the waiting candidates. No signal. He came back. He sat down on the equipment case behind the line and put his head in his hands for a moment. Then he raised it and looked at Claire. "I don't know what the air is doing out there," he said. "It's doing something I can't read." She nodded. She had been watching the canyon the entire time. Not the targets, not the candidates. The canyon itself, the way dust moved at varying elevations. The way the birds of the immediate area were traveling. The way the temperature differential between the shadowed north face and the sunlit south face was playing through the thermal column that rose from the canyon floor. She had her notebook open in her lap. She had not written a single new number since arriving. Everything she needed was already there. 3 more candidates fired between Kowalski and Claire. 3 more misses. 15 candidates, 45 rounds, the canyon still silent. Claire was last. Not by accident. When the shooting order had been posted that morning, her name was last. Briggs had done that himself. Whether it was to maximize the psychological pressure or because he wanted to see every other candidate fail first before she stepped to the line, no one asked. The effect was the same either way. She had 16 people watching her when she picked up her rifle and walked to the firing point. Briggs was standing 15 feet behind the line, arms folded, face unreadable. Maldonado was 6 feet to Briggs's left. He had not moved from that position since the first candidate fired. The Rangemaster Oak stood at the instrumentation panel to the right, watching his readout screen with the patience of a man who had watched it produce no signal for 19 years. Claire lay behind her rifle. She did not set up quickly. She took her time, each movement deliberate, the bipod legs adjusted by fractions, her cheek finding the stock with the ease of something practiced past the point of thought. She established her natural point of aim. She checked her position for tension and released what she found. Then she put her eye to the scope and looked at the far side of the canyon. She could see the target, a gray steel plate on a gray rock shelf at a distance that made it look smaller than it was. The scope closed that distance, but it could not close the air between here and there. The air was where the problem lived. She began her observation cycle, not of the target, of the canyon. She had described this to Reed once in simple terms. The canyon has a breathing pattern. Hot air rises off the rock on the south side. The cooler air from the north face flows in underneath to replace it. This creates a column of moving air at a specific location and altitude. The column rotates in a predictable cycle with an irregular surface interval. The window, the moment when the column's movement pauses between cycles, lasts between 4 and 7 seconds, depending on the solar angle and surface temperature. She had studied that cycle for 31 days. She had identified the window. She knew when it came. She was waiting for it now. 30 seconds passed. At the line, nobody made a sound. The weight of 15 failed attempts and 32 years of institutional failure sat on the air the way humidity sits invisible but felt. Briggs said nothing. Maldonado watched her and said nothing. Reed, standing at the back of the group, realized he was holding his breath and made himself breathe. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The waiting was not a performance. Anyone who understood what she was doing could see it was not theater. She was reading something real. But to the candidates who didn't understand the thermal cycle logic, the waiting looked like paralysis, like hesitation, like someone who had arrived at the line and found exactly what Colonel Briggs had predicted she would find. Behind the group, 2 instructors exchanged a look. One of them said, barely audible, "Clock's running." The other said nothing. Briggs heard it. He did not turn around. His jaw moved slightly. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Claire's breathing was so controlled It was almost imperceptible. 1 breath per 8 seconds. The kind of respiratory rate that takes years to develop and cannot be performed under genuine panic, which meant the waiting was not panic, whatever it looked like from outside. Her father's voice. You don't chase the window, you know it, and you wait for it, and when it comes, your body is already ready because you never stopped being ready. 2 minutes and 55 seconds. She felt it before she saw it. A slight shift in the way the air pressure sat against the left side of her face. A fractional change in the behavior of a dust particle at the canyon rim that her peripheral vision caught without being directed. The cycle was turning. The window was opening. She did not announce it to herself. She did not think a word. Her body had been prepared for this moment for 31 days of preparation and 19 years of training before that, and a childhood spent learning to feel the air rather than just measure it. Her finger was on the trigger. She exhaled. Halfway through the exhale between one heartbeat and the next, in the stillness of her own physiology that she had constructed specifically for this moment, she pressed. The rifle fired. The round crossed 1,420 meters of Nevada Canyon air in slightly under 2 seconds. The instrumentation panel made a sound, not silence. A sound, an electronic tone, flat and functional, and the most significant noise anyone on that range had heard in 32 years. Oakes spun toward his panel. He looked at the readout. He looked at it again. He said in a voice that was completely level, because he was a man who did not dramatize things and had spent 19 years waiting for exactly this moment. And now that it was here, his body had no template for what emotional register to use. Confirmed impact, center mass. Nobody moved. For approximately 3 seconds, 16 candidates and 4 instructors and 1 rangemaster stood on the edge of a Nevada canyon and collectively failed to process what had just happened. Then Reed said under his breath, "Oh my God." And the 3 seconds ended. Kowalski made a sound that was not a word. Delaney grabbed the arm of the man next to him without looking at who it was. Patterson, the SEAL who had shot first, turned around and faced away from the canyon and put his hands on top of his head and stood there for a moment. Claire fired her second round. The instrumentation panel made the sound again. Confirmed impact. The group's reaction was louder this time. A collective exhale and several voices at once, and someone near the back said something that was lost in the noise. She fired her third round. The panel. Confirmed impact. 3 rounds. 3 confirmed impacts on a target that had not been hit in 32 years by 816 attempts from the finest marksmen the United States military had been able to produce. The canyon went from silence to chaos in the space of a breath. Reed stepped forward and then stopped because there was a firing line between him and where Claire was, and range discipline does not dissolve even in the moment when everything else is dissolving. He stopped at the line and looked at her. She was clearing her weapon. Methodically, precisely. The bolt coming back the chamber checked, the safety engaged. The same clearing procedure she would have performed on a routine qualification where nothing unusual had happened. Her hands were not shaking. Reed watched her hands and felt something move through him that he had not expected and could not fully name. It was not simply admiration. It was something closer to what happens when you see something that you understood theoretically in an abstract sense, becomes something real in front of your eyes. The collision between what you believed was possible and what you are now watching happen. He said her name. She looked up. He couldn't find what to say. He just looked at her. She said, "I told you I'd already made it." He laughed. It came out involuntarily, a short, slightly disbelieving sound. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, you did." Briggs had not moved. He was standing in the same position he had occupied since the first candidate walked to the line, arms folded, 15 feet behind the firing point. The instrumentation panel had made it sound 3 times, and he had heard all 3, and his expression had not changed in any way that was visible from outside. But something was happening inside of it. Maldonado, standing 6 feet to his left, turned and looked at him, not with expectation, not with challenge. The way you look at someone when you are simply trying to understand what is occurring in a person you have known for a long time. Briggs was looking at the far side of the canyon. Maldonado said nothing. The candidates were celebrating now, the kind of celebration that happens in groups of disciplined men who don't have a template for genuine elation and express it in the forms available to them. Backslaps, handshakes, the occasional sharp vocalization. Kowalski had crossed the line the moment Claire cleared her weapon and was saying something to her in a low, urgent voice. She was listening. Her face was calm. Maldonado looked back at Briggs. Briggs said very quietly, "What did she read?" "Sir." "She waited 3 minutes before she fired. She was reading something." "What was she reading?" Maldonado considered the question. Then he said, "The thermal cycle. The canyon generates a convective column at the 1400-meter mark. It has a rotation interval with a pause window. She was waiting for the pause." Briggs was quiet. "How long did she study that?" he said. "Best I can determine, sir, about 31 days. She's been tracking atmospheric data on this specific location since week 1 of the program." Briggs absorbed this. Maldonado waited. Then Briggs said, "My spotter on my second attempt at this target, 1989, told me the shot couldn't be made because the thermal column was unreadable. I accepted that assessment." "Yes, sir." "She didn't accept it." "No, sir. She studied it until it wasn't unreadable anymore." Briggs turned away from the canyon. He walked past Maldonado, past the instrumentation panel, past Oakes, who was still studying his readout with the expression of a man who wants to make sure the universe is not playing a joke on him. He walked past the celebrating candidates without acknowledging the celebration. He stopped. Claire was standing about 12 feet from him. Kowalski had moved away. She was holding her rifle at her side, the case at her feet, and she was looking at Briggs with the same level expression she had brought to every interaction since the morning she stepped off the bus and he told her she didn't belong. They were 10 feet apart. The celebration around them was still happening, but in a slightly lower register now because the candidates were tracking this encounter the way people track 2 points of electrical charge moving toward each other. Briggs looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "That was the finest single performance I have observed in 31 years of running marksmanship programs." Claire said nothing. He said, "I owe you an explanation, not an apology. An apology is too easy." He paused. "An explanation." She waited. He said, "This is not the place for it, not with an audience." His eyes moved very slightly toward the candidates around them. "But it will come, before you leave this facility." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, "Well done, Sergeant." He walked toward the vehicles. The candidates watched him go in complete silence. Then they turned back to Claire, and the silence lasted approximately 1 more second before Reed made a sound, and Delaney grabbed her by the shoulder, and Kowalski said something profane and joyful in a voice that carried across half the canyon. Oakes was still at his instrumentation panel. He looked at the readout one more time. He shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when something has finally happened that he has waited 19 years for and has no words adequate to the occasion. He looked at Claire. She looked at him. He said simply, "It's in the record." She nodded. She picked up her rifle case. She walked away from the firing line and found a place to sit by herself away from the group, and she took the photograph from the inside pocket of her jacket. The photograph she had carried since the morning she applied to the program, which she had carried for 19 months through the rejection and the waiting and the second application and the bus ride to Coronado and every qualification and every annotation on Briggs's clipboard. Her father, mid-40s, a military range somewhere in the southwest, the background indistinct, holding a rifle, squinting against the sun with the expression of a man doing the thing he loves most in the world. She had looked at this photograph maybe 600 times in 19 months. She looked at it now. She said not aloud, not in words anyone could hear, but in the private internal language that is the only kind available for communication with the dead, "I promised you." She sat with that for a long moment. Behind her, the celebration continued. Reed was talking loud. Kowalski was laughing, actually laughing, the kind of laugh that comes out when something surprises you in a way that makes the world feel better than it did before. She let herself feel it, not the triumph. She had never been interested in triumph as a feeling. What she felt was simpler and older than that. Relief. The particular relief of having carried something heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. She put the photograph away. She sat for another moment. Then she stood, picked up her rifle case, and walked back toward the group. Reed saw her coming and made space for her in the circle, which was not a formal gesture, but was understood by everyone who saw it, which was everyone. The circle opened for her the way circles open in for people who have just demonstrated something that reorganizes everyone's understanding of what is possible. She stepped into it, and for the first time since she arrived at Coronado, there was nothing in the space around her that felt like resistance. What was there instead was something that most of the men in that circle had not felt in her presence before, the particular warmth of being in the company of someone who has just done something you will tell people about for the rest of your life. Vasquez said, "I want to know about the thermal cycle." Delaney said, "I want the whole course, everything she knows." Patterson said, "I'll pay tuition." She looked around the circle at the faces. Faces that had been skeptical 6 weeks ago. Faces that had shifted and adjusted and reconsidered over the daily accumulation of evidence that a belief was wrong. She said, "I'll teach you what my father taught me." The offer settled over the group like something solid. She meant it. She had always meant it. Because that too was something he had taught her. Not just how to breathe the air. Not just how to wait for the window. But the knowledge is not yours unless you share it. The shot is not complete until the next person learns to make it. Across the range, Briggs reached the lead vehicle and stopped. He put his hand on the door but did not open it. He stood there for a moment with his back to the canyon, looking at nothing, and the Nevada wind moved across the back of his neck, and somewhere on the far side of the canyon, a steel plate sat with 3 fresh impacts in its center that had not been there an hour ago and would never not be there again. He thought about his sister. He thought about the day she left a program that had not been able to make a space for her. He thought about what he had believed that meant. He thought about Claire Donovan reading birds on a California range in the 2nd week of training and hitting a perfect score, and how he had written inconsistent with available data on the score sheet because he needed to be right more than he needed to be honest. He opened the vehicle door. He did not get in. He stood with the door open for a moment and looked back at the group gathered around the firing line, and at the woman in the center of it who was explaining something with her hands, probably the thermal cycle, probably exactly what she had read in the canyon, and at the faces around her, which were the faces of very capable men leaning in to understand something they hadn't known they didn't know. He had one conversation left to have before this day was over. He had told her he would have it. He was going to keep that word. He closed the vehicle door. He walked back toward the range. He walked back across the range with the particular deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it before he fully understands what it will cost him. The candidates saw him coming. The circle around Claire didn't dissolve immediately. It shifted, adjusted the way a group of people moves when authority approaches, and they are not sure whether the authority is coming for them or for something else. Reed stepped back half a step. Kowalski turned. Delaney stopped talking mid-sentence. Briggs stopped 6 feet from the edge of the group. He looked at Claire. "Sergeant Donovan," he said, "I need 15 minutes. The group read the room instantly. Nobody needed to be told. Vasquez picked up an equipment case. Patterson found somewhere else to be. Reed held his position a half-second longer than the others, long enough to make it clear he was aware of the moment, and then he moved. Kowalski was the last to go. He looked at Claire. She gave him the smallest nod. He walked away. Briggs waited until the last man was out of a reasonable earshot. Then he said, "Walk with me." They walked parallel to the canyon rim, away from the vehicles and the instrumentation panel, and the 18 years of Oakes's institutional memory and the physical fact of 3 impact marks on a steel plate that had been clean for 32 years. They walked in silence for about 40 seconds. Then Briggs stopped. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at the ground for a moment with the expression of a man organizing something difficult into the order it needs to be said. He said, "I had a sister." Claire waited. Younger than me by 4 years. Her name was Margaret. She was the kind of person who walked into rooms and made them better without trying. He paused. She was also the most physically capable woman I have ever known. Competitive swimmer, distance runner. She could outperform most of the men I knew at 22. She applied to a federal law enforcement tactical program in 1987. He was quiet for a moment. "She was the only woman in the selection class," he said. "She was technically qualified. Her scores were good. Her physical benchmarks were above the program minimum across every category." He stopped. But the environment, the daily accumulation of the environment, broke something in her. Not her body. Her body was fine. Something else. The isolation. The signal delivered daily in 100 small ways that she was in the wrong place, that she was tolerated rather than wanted, that every success she had was going to be questioned and every failure was going to be amplified. He turned and looked at Claire. She withdrew from the program in week 5, he said. She came home. She never talked about it directly, but I watched what it did to her over the following years. The way it sat in her, the way she stopped reaching for things after that. Like the withdrawal had taken something structural out of her, and she could never fully rebuild it. Claire said nothing. She was looking at him with the focused attention of someone who understands that what is being said is costing the speaker something significant. I was 26 years old when that happened, Briggs said. I was already in the Navy. I was already building the framework of beliefs that became the foundation of how I've run every program I've ever run. He paused, and I made a decision consciously that I have carried for almost 40 years. I decided that what happened to Margaret was the natural result of putting women in environments that were not designed for them. I decided that the compassionate response, the protective response, was to prevent it from happening again. He stopped. The Nevada wind came across the canyon rim and moved between them. I believed I was protecting women, he said. For almost 40 years, that's what I believed I was doing. Claire said, and now, the question arrived quietly, but it landed like the thing it was the center of everything. Briggs looked at her. Now, he said, I understand that I was not protecting women. I was protecting a decision I made at 26 years old that allowed me to feel like the environment that failed my sister was justified rather than broken. He paused. And I have spent 40 years administering that broken environment to every woman who has come near a program I control and calling it compassion. The admission came out of him slowly, the way something comes out of a person when it has been held under pressure for a very long time and the pressure finally exceeds the capacity to contain it. Claire looked at him for a long moment. She said, what happened to your sister wasn't the natural result of women being in those environments. It was the result of those environments being run by men who believed what you believed. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, I know that now. She didn't fail the program, Claire said. The program failed her. He said nothing, his jaw tightened. Not in resistance, in the particular way that a person's face tightens when they are absorbing something true that hurts. She said, and the difference between her story and mine isn't that I'm stronger than she was. It's that I had something she didn't have. What's that? A father who spent 20 years telling me that what other people decided about my limits was information about them, not about me. She paused. Well, every woman who comes through a program like this has that. And the ones who don't, the ones who are absorbing the signal, you're talking about the daily signal that they're in the wrong place. They need the environment to be different. Not because they're weaker, because no human being performs at their ceiling in a system that is actively working against them. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, your father knew about this program. Yes. He told you about Ghost Target 7 specifically. When I was 17. And he believed you could make the shot. She looked at him steadily. He believed the shot could be made by anyone who was willing to learn the canyon instead of fighting it. He believed most people who attempted it were trying to overpower a problem that required patience instead. She paused. He believed I had the patience. Briggs said he was right. He said it simply, not as a compliment, as a fact being entered into the record. He looked at the canyon for a moment, then he looked back at her. I annotated your scores, he said. Multiple times, I questioned your methodology on the wind call in week 2. I flagged your stalk time as a possible route deviation. I attributed your night qualification result to equipment miscalibration. I know, she said. None of those annotations were justified by the evidence. No, she said, Marion. They weren't. I was looking for a way to make the evidence fit a conclusion I had already reached before you stepped off that bus. He paused. That is not evaluation. That is confirmation of a bias I had already decided was a principle. Claire said, are you telling me this because you want absolution? The question was direct and he received it directly. No, he said. I'm telling you this because you are owed the truth about what was done to you in this program, and I am the only person who can give it to you accurately. He paused. And because I have a program to run after you leave, and the way I run it from this point forward has to be different from the way I've run it until now. And making that change without acknowledging what drove the old way would be, he stopped, dishonest. That word from this man in this context landed with a weight that Claire felt physically. She said, "What are you going to change?" He looked at her. Something shifted in his posture, subtle, the kind of shift that happens in a person when they move from confession to commitment. Evaluation criteria, he said, written, documented, objective, applied identically regardless of who is being evaluated. No annotation that isn't supported by observed evidence. No additional qualifications introduced during the final week of a program that aren't in the original course documentation. He paused. And a review of every candidate evaluation I've signed in the last 11 years, looking specifically for patterns of inconsistency that correlate with gender. Claire was quiet for a moment. She said, "That last one is going to be hard." "Yes. There are going to be findings you don't want to see." "Probably," he said. "I'm going to look anyway." She studied him. This was not a performance she was watching. She had been in enough high-pressure environments with enough people to understand the difference between what a person says when they are managing optics and what a person says when something in them has genuinely changed. The body carries that difference. The voice carries it. The eyes carry it most of all. Briggs's eyes were carrying it. She said, "Your sister, does she know what she meant to the decisions you made?" He looked away briefly. "No, but are you going to tell her?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think I have to." She nodded. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "The first week, the morning I read your name off the manifest and announced in front of the entire class that you were going to fail." He paused. "What did you think in that moment?" "Exactly." She considered the question. "I thought," she said slowly, "that you were giving me the most important piece of intelligence I was going to receive in this program." He looked at her. "Which was that the only shot that would matter was the one that couldn't be questioned. Everything before that shot was going to be fought and annotated and challenged. So everything before that shot only needed to keep me in the program. The real test was always going to be the canyon." He was quiet. "I knew what the canyon was," she said. "My father told me. I'd been preparing for it for 17 years. And you pointed at it for me on day one by telling me that conventional performance wasn't going to be enough." She paused. "In a way, you put me on the path to that shot the moment you decided I was going to fail." Briggs absorbed this. He said, "That is either the most generous interpretation of what I did to you or the most accurate. I'm not sure which." "Both," she said, "at the same time." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Your father would have liked this program under different circumstances." She felt something move through her. Not pain, Sharon, the adjacent thing. "He would have loved it," she said. "He applied twice." Briggs went very still. "He was rejected both times," she said. "Administrative grounds officially. His commanding officer in those years told him informally that the program's leadership had concerns about his age at point of application." "How old was he?" 36 on the first application, 38 on the second. Briggs said nothing for a moment. "That's within program parameters." "Yes," she said, "it is." The implications settled between them. Another decision made by someone in authority using available tools to justify a predetermined conclusion. Briggs said quietly, "He never made the shot." "No," she said, "he never got the chance." She paused. "So I made it for both of us," she said. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted in a way that was not visible in the structural features of it, but was present in the quality of his attention. The kind of shift that happens in a person when they are confronted by the full weight of a consequence they set in motion. He said, "I'm sorry for what was done to him and for what I did to you." The words came without performance, without the particular inflation that apologies sometimes carry when the person delivering them is more focused on being seen to apologize than on the person they are apologizing to. Claire received them. She said, "Don't just be sorry, be different." He held her eyes. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." They stood there for a moment in the Nevada wind, two people on either side of a very long history, the distance between them measurable in decades of decisions in one afternoon in a canyon. Then Briggs said, "There's something else you should know." She waited. "Maldonado submitted a formal documentation file to a 2-star general 3 days ago," he said. It details the evaluation irregularities in your program record. Every annotation, every additional qualification, every score questioning. He paused. He didn't tell me before he did it. He told me this morning. Claire said, "What are you going to do about it?" Briggs said, "Nothing." She looked at him. "He's right," Briggs said. "The documentation is accurate. The general should have it. Whatever review follows from it, I'll cooperate fully." He paused. "It's what the evidence requires." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression shifted very slightly. Not softness, respect. The particular kind of respect that arrives when a person does something difficult that they did not have to do. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. They walked back toward the group. The candidates had reassembled near the vehicles, and the atmosphere of the range had changed in the way that atmospheres change after something significant has happened, and the people present are still processing the size of it. The celebration had settled into something quieter. Conversations in small clusters. Men sitting on equipment cases, talking in the low, earnest register of people who have just shared an experience that rearranged their understanding of something. Reed saw them coming back together and watched Briggs's posture and watched Claire's face and assembled what information he could from the visible evidence, which was not the full story, but was enough. He leaned toward Kowalski. Kowalski said without Reed saying a word, "Whatever happened over there, it was real." "Yeah," Reed said. "She looks the same," Kowalski said. "He doesn't." Reed looked at Briggs. The colonel's posture was the same structurally, shoulders back, spine straight, the bearing of 30 years of military service that doesn't go away on its own. But something in the weight of his expression was different. The quality of certainty that had occupied his face since the first morning of the program was not entirely there anymore. In its place was something more honest and more human and considerably more difficult to carry. Briggs stopped in front of the assembled candidates. He looked at the group. He said, "What happened today goes into the program record. Ghost Target 7 confirmed. 3 impacts. Sergeant Donovan's name will be listed first on the record of successful qualification because she is the first successful qualification this target has seen in 32 years. He paused. "That record belongs to this program and to everyone who was on this range today when it was made." He looked around the group. "The convoy returns to Coronado at 1400, he said. "Graduation formation is in 4 days. Every candidate still in this program will be evaluated on their full program record. Objective criteria, written documentation." He paused. "Starting today, that is the standard this program applies." He looked at nobody specific. He looked at everybody. "Dismiss to vehicles," he said. He walked to the lead vehicle. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Delaney said, "Did he just—" "Yes," Reed said. "He announced an evaluation standard change in the middle of a Nevada range." "Yes." "In front of witnesses." "Yes." Kowalski said, "Maldonado is going to need a bigger documentation file." It broke the tension. Several people laughed. Even Vasquez, who was not a man who laughed easily, made a sound that qualified. Claire was standing at the edge of the group. She had heard all of it. She watched Briggs reach the lead vehicle and get in this time and pull the door closed. Oakes appeared beside her. He was holding a printed confirmation sheet from the instrumentation panel. 3 lines, timestamps, confirmation codes, impact coordinates on the target face. He held it out. She looked at it. "Right back down." "I print one of these every class," he said. 19 years. I've got a filing cabinet full of them." He paused. "They all say no confirmation. This is the first one that doesn't." She took it. She looked at the 3 lines. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Oakes." He said, "Thank your father. Whatever he taught you, that's what made that shot." She looked at him. He shrugged. "I've watched a lot of shooters, the ones who make shots that nobody else can make. They're always carrying somebody else's knowledge on top of their own. Some teacher, some mentor, somebody who saw what they could be before they could see it themselves." He paused. "Yours was your father, I can tell by how you waited. The patience isn't learned in a program. That kind of patience is personal." She folded the confirmation sheet carefully. She put it in her jacket pocket next to the photograph. Reed appeared at her shoulder. "Convoy's loading." She picked up her rifle case. They walked toward the vehicles together. Around them, the Nevada air moved through the canyon in the pattern it had been moving in for 32 years, the thermal column rising and pausing and rising again. indifferent to everything that had just happened on the edge of it, doing exactly what it had always done. The difference was that someone had finally paid attention to it. In the vehicle, as the convoy pulled out and the facility disappeared behind them, and the Nevada highway opened up in front, Claire held the confirmation sheet in her lap and looked at it one more time. 3 lines, 3 confirmed impacts. 32 years of institutional silence ended. Reed, sitting beside her, was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What did he say, Briggs, when you walked with him?" "He told me about his sister," she said. Reed turned and looked at her. "He has a sister. Had a difficult experience in a selection program in 1987, she said. Withdrew in week 5. It shaped everything he believed about women in these environments." Reed was quiet. "He thought he was protecting women," she said, "by keeping them out. He convinced himself it was compassionate. And now," she looked at the confirmation sheet, "now he understands that protection and exclusion are not the same thing." She paused. "And he's going to have to live with the distance between what he believed and what he actually did." Reed said, "Is that enough knowing it?" She thought about this. "It's the beginning of enough," she said. "What comes after the knowing is what determines whether it's actually enough." The highway ran straight through the desert. Delaney on Claire's other side had been quiet through this exchange. Now he said, without looking up from the window, "My father was wrong about a thing for 30 years. Really wrong. The kind of wrong that cost people." Nobody asked him to continue, but he did. The day he figured it out, he sat at the kitchen table and didn't move for 2 hours. "My mother tried to talk to him and he just couldn't. Because figuring out you've been wrong isn't the hard part." He paused. "The hard part is figuring out what you owe to every year you spent being wrong." Claire said, "Yeah. Does Briggs get that?" She thought about the expression on Briggs's face when she told him her father had applied to the program twice and been rejected. The specific quality of stillness that had come over him. "He's starting to," she said. The convoy drove south. The Nevada mountains fell away behind them. The desert opened into the long, flat approach to California, and the Pacific Ocean waited somewhere ahead in the late afternoon, invisible but certain the way certain things are when you know they're there, even if you can't see them yet. In the lead vehicle, Briggs sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the road. His aide, a young lieutenant named Carver, who had learned over 2 years not to speak unless spoken to in the vehicle, sat in the driver's seat and drove and said nothing. After 40 minutes, Briggs said, "Carver, sir, pull up the evaluation documentation for every female candidate this program has processed in the last 11 years. Carver glanced at him sideways. "Sir, there are only 3 of those and they all withdrew before." "I know how many there are," Briggs said. "Pull the files." Carver reached for the tablet in the center console. Briggs said, "And get me a contact number for my sister." Carver stopped. He turned and looked at Briggs. Briggs said, "Eyes on the road, Lieutenant." Carver turned back. "Yes, sir." He pulled up the files. Outside, the desert moved past. The sun was dropping toward the western edge of the sky. Somewhere behind them, the canyon sat in the lengthening afternoon light with 3 new marks on a steel plate and 32 years of silence finally broken. And in the second vehicle, Claire Donovan sat with a confirmation sheet in her pocket and a photograph beside it, in the particular stillness of a woman who has kept a promise and is now beginning to understand for the first time what it means to live in a world where that promise has been kept. She had spent 19 months focused entirely on a single goal. Every decision, every calculation, every early morning, and every late night had been organized around one convergence point: the canyon, the shot, the window that her father told her would open if she was willing to learn it. The window had opened. She had stepped into it. And now the world on the other side of it was beginning to become real. And it was larger than the goal, and she was going to have to figure out who she was in it. She sat with them. The highway ran south. The Pacific grew closer with every mile. And in the lead vehicle, a colonel who had been wrong for 40 years was making a phone call he should have made a long time ago. His sister answered on the 3rd ring. "Nathan." Her voice after all this time was still familiar in the way that family voices are familiar, different in every surface quality from the young woman's voice he remembered, but carrying the same underlying signature. "Margaret," he said. He paused for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something. About 1987, about what happened to you in that program." Another pause. "About what I understood it to mean, and about why I was wrong." A long silence from the other end. Then she said quietly, "Nathan, I've been waiting 39 years for this call." He closed his eyes briefly. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry it took this long." He meant it. In the way that a man means something when he has just watched a woman make a shot that reorganized everything he thought he understood, and then walked with her to the edge of a canyon and been told the truth about the cost of what he spent 40 years believing. He meant it all the way down. The convoy moved south through the desert carrying 16 candidates and 4 instructors, and the weight of a day that none of them were going to forget toward a base on the California coast, where graduation was 4 days away, and something was different now, fundamentally and irreversibly different in the way the program would run from this point forward. The 4 days between the Nevada Canyon and graduation moved differently than any other 4 days in the program. Not slower, not faster, differently. The way time moves when the defining event has already happened and everything that follows exists in its gravity organized around it, pulling toward the meaning of it, whether anyone intends that or not. They returned to Coronado late on the evening of the Canyon Day, and the base absorbed them back into its routines without ceremony, because military bases do not pause for significance. They simply continue, and the people inside them continue with them. Equipment was cleaned and logged. After-action documentation was filed. The duty officer recorded the convoy's return. Life at the program level proceeded exactly as it always had, except that 16 candidates moved through those routines with the specific quality of people who had witnessed something that had changed a reference point inside them, and reference points, once changed, do not change back. The morning after they returned, Claire was at the equipment bay at 0530, not because she was required to be, because she had woken at 04 and spent 40 minutes lying on her bunk, understanding that she was not going back to sleep, and the equipment bay was where she went when her mind was working and her body needed something to do with its hands. She was cleaning her rifle when Maldonado came in. He poured himself coffee from the equipment bay's ancient percolator that produced something that technically qualified as coffee, the way technically qualified as shelter. And he sat down across from her on an overturned crate. He said, "How are you?" Not a question. A statement with the intonation of a question, the way people say it when they actually want to know. She said, "I'm good." "That's the first time in 6 weeks you haven't given me a one-word answer to that." She looked up. "You've been asking every week in passing. You always said fine." She thought about this. Fine was accurate, and good is different. She ran the cleaning patch through the barrel one more time. Fine is a status report. Good is a feeling. She paused. "Yesterday was the first time I felt good in about 19 months. Maldonado drank his coffee and said nothing for a moment. Then, "He's going to do it, you know, what he said about the evaluation criteria, the documentation review. He's going to follow through." "I know. You don't seem surprised." "I'm not. He's a man who does what he says he'll do. That was always true. The problem was what he was deciding to do." She set the cleaning rod down. "Now that the decision has changed, the follow-through will be reliable." Maldonado looked at her. "You've thought a lot about him." "I've thought a lot about what drives him," she said. "There's a difference. I was never angry at him personally. He wasn't being cruel. He was being afraid in the language of principle, which is a very common human failure." She paused. "Understanding what drives a person doesn't mean you accept what they do. It means you know where to find the lever." He was quiet for a moment. The canyon was the lever. The canyon was the lever. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He said, "Your father would have been here for this, if things had been different." She looked up. "I looked at the old application files," he said, "for the years when he applied. I found the notes from the selection committee." He stopped. The committee chair in both years made the same notation. Candidate profile non-standard. That was the entire justification. She held his gaze. "Non-standard," she said. "Non-standard." He set his mug down, which was the word that committee used for anything it hadn't decided in advance to accept. She was quiet for a moment. "Does that notation appear in the review Briggs is conducting?" she asked. "It will," Maldonado said. "I made sure of it." He walked out. She sat with the rifle in her lap for a long time after he left, not cleaning it anymore, just sitting, thinking about a man who applied twice to a program that was never going to letting him in, and came home both times and said nothing about the reasons, and taught his daughter everything he knew anyway, and lay in a hospital bed at the end of his life, and made her promise to finish what he had started without telling her that was what he was asking her to do. He had known. Of course he had known. The promise hadn't just been about her career. It had been about him. She set the rifle down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Not crying, the pressure before the decision whether to cry, which is its own distinct physical state. She held it there for a moment. Then she lowered her hands and picked up the rifle and put it back in the case and closed the latches with the two clean snaps of a well-maintained mechanism. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to the last page. The window opens. She had written that the night before the convoy, beside today's date. She turned to a new page. She wrote, "He always knew it would." She closed the notebook. She stood up and walked out of the equipment bay into the early morning where the Pacific was doing whatever the Pacific was always doing, which was existing in its vast and indifferent way. Just beyond the edge of the base, and the air off it was cool and carried salt in the specific quality of California mornings that makes people understand why people move there and stay. She stood in it for a moment, then as she went to breakfast. The graduation formation was set for 0900 on the fourth day in the main parade ground at the base's administrative center. 16 candidates had arrived in Nevada. 16 candidates completed the program. The two-star general that Maldonado had been in contact with sent word through his aide that he intended to be present for the graduation, which was unusual, and which Briggs acknowledged without comment when Carver told him. The morning of graduation, Reed found Claire in the barracks at 0700, already in her dress uniform, sitting on her footlocker, with the confirmation sheet from the instrumentation panel unfolded in her lap. He sat down across from her. He said, "How do you feel?" She looked up. "Good." He smiled at that, not a small smile, the full version. "Good," he said. "Yeah, me too." He paused. "My family's here. My wife drove down from Pendleton with my kids last night. I told them about you." She looked at him. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I spent 6 weeks in a program with the best shooter I've ever seen," he said, "and that she also happened to be the best teacher." He paused. "My daughter is 11. She wanted to know if you were a soldier." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were a sniper." She didn't know exactly what that meant, so I explained it and she thought about it, and then she said, "Is she the kind of person who does things other people say girls can't do?" And I said yes. He paused. "She wants to meet you." Claire was quiet for a moment. She said, "Tell her to come find me after the formation." He nodded. He started to stand. Then he stopped. He said, "Can I ask you something I've been thinking about for 4 days?" "Yes." "The canyon. When the window opened, when you felt the cycle turn, were you scared?" She considered the question. "No, not at all. Not the way you mean. There was something, but it wasn't fear." She thought about it. "You know how your hands feel right before you make a shot you've made 10,000 times. Not nervous, not calm exactly, alert. The body knowing exactly what it's about to do and being completely ready for it." "Yes," he said. "That's what it was. Every preparation I'd made was already in place. The calculation was done. The adjustment was set. All that was left was the moment." She paused. "Failure is what happens when you are not prepared. I was prepared, so there was no room for it." Reed looked at her for a moment. He said, "Your father really did give you everything, didn't he?" She looked down at the confirmation sheet in her lap. "Everything that mattered," she said. At 0800, Briggs held a final program briefing in the main classroom. 16 candidates in their dress uniforms, seated in the same chairs they had occupied 6 weeks ago when he had stood at the front and publicly told Claire she was going to fail. He stood at the front now. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the group. Then he said, "I am going to say something to this group that I have not said to any previous class. And I am going to say it here in this room with all of you present, because this is where the statement that requires a correction was made." The room went completely still. 6 weeks ago, he said, "I stood in front of you and announced before she had fired a single round that Sergeant Donovan was going to fail this program. I framed it as adherence to standard. It was not adherence to standard. It was a bias that I had carried for 40 years and applied to this program's candidates in ways that were not justified by evidence. He paused. That statement was wrong. The pattern of evaluation that followed it was wrong. And I am correcting the record in front of the same audience that witnessed the original error, because that is the only correction that is adequate to the size of the mistake. Nobody breathed. He looked at Claire directly. Sergeant Donovan, he said, the evaluation record from your time in this program will be revised to reflect your actual performance without the annotations that were applied inconsistently. Your scores, as recorded without those annotations, are the highest composite scores this program has recorded in 11 years. He paused. That is the accurate record. That is the record you earned. He looked back at the room. This program's evaluation standards are being revised, he said. Written, objective, documented, applied identically. That revision goes into effect immediately. It applies to every candidate who comes through this program from this point forward. He paused. Including any candidate whose profile has historically been described by this program as non-standard. He said that last word with a weight that several people in the room felt without knowing exactly why. Maldonado, standing at the back of the room, looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. Briggs said, "Dismissed to formation." The room moved. Chairs scraped. People stood. And in the specific acoustic of 16 dress uniforms moving toward a door, there was the subdued energy of people who have just witnessed something they understand is significant without fully having language for it yet. Kowalski, passing Claire on the way out, said without slowing, "He just did that in front of everyone?" "Yes," she said. "That's going to follow him." "It should," she said. "It earned the right to." The formation assembled at 0855. The two-star general, whose name was Harrington and who had the particular bearing of a man who has spent 40 years earning every piece of metal on his chest and knows the weight of each one, arrived at 0858 with a single aide and took a position to the right of the reviewing stand. Maldonado had briefed him. The documentation file had done the rest. He looked at the formation. The way generals look at formations comprehensively, in the way that a person trained to assess a situation absorbs it all at once rather than sequentially. His eyes found Claire. He did not acknowledge her specifically in that moment. He turned to his aide and said something quiet. The aide wrote something. Then Harrington looked back at the formation and waited for the ceremony to begin. The graduation itself followed the program's established format because military ceremonies follow established formats, and the significance of a moment is carried not in the deviation from the form, but inside it. Names were called, certificates were presented. The program's history was acknowledged briefly by the officer of record. When Briggs reached Claire's name, he paused one beat longer than he had paused for any other name. He said, "Sergeant Claire Donovan, top graduate class composite score. First confirmed qualification on Ghost Target 7 in 32 years of program history." He looked up from the certificate. He said, "Sergeant Donovan embodies what this program exists to produce, not because of the shots she made, because of the preparation, discipline, patience, and generosity to others that preceded it. Those qualities are what made the shot possible. They are also what made every candidate around her better." He paused. "This program is better for her presence in it. The record will reflect that." He held out the certificate. She walked forward and received it. They stood face to face. He said quietly for her alone, "Your father would have stood here." She looked at him. "Someday," he said, "this program is going to graduate candidates who learn to read the canyon from the methodology you leave behind. They won't know your name when they do it, but they'll be using what you built." He paused. "That matters more than the certificate." She said, "Make sure the door's open for them." "It will be," he said. She took the certificate. She returned to her position in the formation. After the ceremony, General Harrington sought her out personally, not through an aide. He walked across the parade ground himself and stopped in front of her and said without preamble, "I read Maldonado's file." "Yes, sir," she said. "All of it," he said, "including the section about your father's applications." She held his gaze. "I'm going to ask you something directly," he said, "and I want a direct answer." "Yes, sir." "Is there anything this program or this branch's leadership can do that would constitute an adequate response to what was done to you and to your father?" She thought about the question. It was the right question, and it deserved the right answer. She said, "Open the door and keep it open, not for women specifically, For anyone whose record merits being here regardless of what a committee decides their profile looks like on paper. Make the evaluation criteria mean what they say. Apply them the same way to every person who walks through the gate. She paused. If you do that, then what was done to my father and to me becomes the last time it happens, rather than a pattern that continues. That's the adequate response. Harrington looked at her for a moment. He said, done. One word, the weight of 2 stars behind it. He shook her hand. He walked back to his aide. She stood on the parade ground with the certificate in one hand and the Nevada confirmation sheet still in her jacket pocket beside the photograph, and she felt the particular quality of stillness that follows the end of a very long effort. The stillness that is not emptiness, but fullness, the kind that comes when a thing that has occupied you completely finally resolves, and you are left in the space where the occupation used to be, and you have to learn what it is to exist in that space. Reed appeared with his family, his wife, a calm and capable-looking woman named Sarah, who shook Claire's hand with both of hers and said, "My husband has talked about nothing else for a week. I feel like I know you." His son, who was 14 and was trying very hard to appear as though he was not impressed by the military setting and was failing entirely. And his daughter, 11 years old, dark hair. The particular serious expression of a child who is genuinely thinking about something rather than performing the appearance of thought. She looked at Claire and said, "Are you the one who made the impossible shot?" Claire said, "I made a shot that people said was impossible." The girl thought about this distinction. Is there a difference? "A big one," Claire said. "Impossible means it can't be done. What people said was impossible means they hadn't done it yet. Those are very different statements." The girl looked at her. "How did you know it wasn't really impossible?" Claire looked at her for a moment. She said, "My father told me. He said the canyon wasn't unshootable. It just hadn't been shot yet. And he said the day would come when someone who had done the preparation would be there at the right moment." She paused. "He spent my whole childhood making sure that if that person was going to be anybody, it was going to be me." The girl said, "Where is he now?" The question arrived the way children's questions arrive directly without the protective social scaffolding that adults build around difficult subjects. Claire said, "He died 19 months ago. He didn't get to see it." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the uncomplicated certainty of 11 years old, "He knows." Claire looked at her. "He taught you how to do it," the girl said. "So he knew you were going to do it." "So he already knew." Reed, standing 2 feet away, looked at the sky for a moment. Claire said, "Yeah." And her voice was level and entirely controlled, and only somebody who had been watching her for 6 weeks would have known how much that cost. "I think you're right." The girl nodded, satisfied. Reed said, "Emily, why don't you, It's okay," Claire said. She looked at Emily. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Emily said without hesitation. "Something people say girls can't do." Reed made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else. Claire said, "Good. When you find out what it is, start studying it immediately. Don't wait until you're in the room. Do the work before they let you in the room so that when you get there, you're already ready." Emily looked at her with the particular focused attention of a child filing something away. Then she said, "Can I have your autograph?" Claire laughed. It came out naturally without effort, the laugh of a person who is genuinely surprised by delight. She signed the program from the graduation ceremony that Emily produced from her jacket pocket with the preparedness of someone who had planned this in advance. Reed's wife said quietly to Reed while this was happening, "I understand now. What you said about her." Reed said, "Yeah. You said she made everyone around her better." "She did." "It's because she doesn't hold anything back," his wife said. "She shares everything she knows." "That's rare." Reed watched Claire hand the program back to his daughter. "Rarer than the shooting," he said. Kowalski found her an hour later after the families had begun to disperse, and the formal portion of the day had settled into the informal portion, which in military graduations means standing in groups in dress uniforms talking about the thing that just happened and the things that are going to happen next. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "I was one of the guys," he said, "in the first week. I made a comment about it being a long 6 weeks. You heard it." "I heard it," she said. "I didn't think you belonged here," he said. Not because I had a reason, it was what I assumed. Nobody had given me a reason to assume differently, and I hadn't asked myself whether I needed one. He stopped. That was lazy thinking. And I've had a month to watch what happens when someone operates at a completely different level than your assumptions about them. And I wanted you to know that I know the distance between what I assumed and what's true. She looked at him. Kowalski, she said, the night you asked me about the bird methodology. That was the moment. What moment? When you stopped assuming and started asking. That's the only moment that matters. What came before it is just the time it took you to get there. She paused. You got there. That's what counts. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to teach it, he said. The wind reading, the environmental observation, everything you showed me. When I go back to my unit, I'm going to teach it. Good, she said. Change one word of it and I'll haunt you. He laughed. The full version. The kind he'd kept back for weeks. Delaney came by, then Vasquez, then Augustine, the force recon sergeant who had asked her in the field about reading grass. One by one they found her not in a formal procession, but in the organic way of people who have something they need to say and find the right moment to say it. Each one different, each one real. She received all of it. Briggs found her last. The parade ground had largely cleared. The general had departed. The families were gone. The support staff had begun the administrative dismantlement of the ceremony that follows every ceremony in the military, the stacking and storing and documenting that makes the whole thing disappear back into the base's bureaucratic skeleton. Briggs walked across the empty ground toward her. He was out of ceremony mode now. The formal posture was still there because it was structural, not performed. But the weight of the morning had settled differently on him than it had started. He stopped. He said, I spoke to my sister last night. She waited. We talked for 3 hours, he said. That's more than we've talked in the last 5 years combined. He was quiet for a moment. She cried, I cried. We haven't done that together since our mother's funeral. Claire said nothing. She told me something I didn't know, he said. She applied to a second program after she withdrew from the first one. A different agency, different city. She made it through the first week and then withdrew voluntarily. He stopped. She said she withdrew because she had already learned that there was no point, that the decision had already been made before she arrived, that the signals would always be there and the performance would never be enough. He paused. She stopped trying because people like me taught her that trying was a category of behavior that didn't apply to her. He looked at Claire with something in his face that was beyond apology, and short of resolution, the middle state that people occupy when they have understood something fully and are beginning the long work of living with that understanding. He said, she asked me about you. I told her what you did. I told her about the canyon. He paused. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, so it was possible the whole time. Claire felt that. She felt it in the specific way that certain sentences arrive when they carry the weight of someone else's lost decades inside them. She said, will she be all right? I don't know, Briggs said. She's 61 years old. She has a life she built around the shape of that withdrawal, around the contours of what she was told she couldn't do. He stopped, but she said something at the end of the call. She said, tell her she did it for all of us. The parade ground was almost empty now. The Nevada confirmation sheet was in Claire's pocket. The photograph was beside it. She thought about her father's hands, steady at the end, the stillness that was discipline so deep it had become nature. She thought about a woman named Margaret who applied to a program in 1987 and was taught that trying was a category that didn't apply to her. She thought about the shot, the 4 seconds of the window, 1,420 meters, the canyon that had been silent for 32 years. She thought about Emily Reed, 11 years old, wanting to do something people said girls couldn't do. She said, tell her she's right. Briggs nodded. He held out his hand. She shook it. He said, where do you go from here? She thought about it. Back to work, she said. There are candidates coming up behind me who are going to need what my father taught me, and a canyon that needs to not be a mystery to the next generation. He said, I'll make sure the methodology is documented in the program record. Under your name. She shook her head. Under my father's name, she said. Raymond Donovan, Master Sergeant USMC. He built the methodology. I just proved it worked. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. He said both names. She considered it. Both names, she said. He walked away. She stood alone on the parade ground for the last time. The Pacific moved its air across the base in the patient way it had been doing for millions of years before the base existed and would continue doing for millions after it was gone. The flag at the center of the ground moved in that air. The base carried on its continuous life around her vehicles, voices the distant sound of a helicopter somewhere to the north. She reached into her pocket. She took out the photograph. Her father, mid-40s, a rifle range somewhere in the southwest, squinting against the sun. She looked at him for a long time. She said inside the private language, the one no one else could hear, I kept the promise, both of them. Yours and mine. She stood there until she had finished saying everything that needed to be said in that language. Then she put the photograph back. She put the confirmation sheet back beside it. She picked up her cover, settled it, and walked across the parade ground toward whatever came next. The canyon in Nevada sat 3,200 feet up in the mountains with 3 impact marks on a steel plate and a thermal column that rose and paused and rose again, doing what it had always done, indifferent to history, indifferent to records, indifferent to the 32 years of silence that had just been broken. But the silence was broken. And the name that broke it was already being written into the record of the program and into the memory of 15 candidates who had been in the room when it happened, and into the understanding of a colonel who was going to spend the rest of his career building something different from what he had built before, and into the kept promise at the center of a daughter's life, and into the meaning of a father's teaching, which had traveled from his hands to hers and from hers out into the world through every candidate she had shown it to, and which would keep traveling long after the program's current class had dispersed to their postings and their careers and their own long labors. The knowledge does not end with the person who carries it. It ends only when the last person who learned it stops passing it forward. Claire Donovan was not the last person. She was the beginning. And that is the only kind of victory that cannot be taken away, the kind that multiplies when you give it to someone else, that grows stronger in the sharing that survives the person who started it because it has already taken root in the people around them. That is what her father built in her. That is what she carried to the canyon. That is what she left behind. And no annotation on any clipboard in any program run by any colonel will ever change that.